Welcome to Revenue Unscripted, the show for B2B founders, CEOs, advisors, and leaders, where we unpack what really drives stronger revenue and margins. Not just product, not just process, but people and behaviors. I'm your host, Jenica Dixon, president of the Slattery Sales Group, and together we're going to dive into how real organizations build high-performing sales cultures, avoid costly mistakes, and turn complex deals into predictable growth. And today I am joined by Farah Ruthnam-Sandys from Neudata, where she leads revenue across the Americas and has spent years turning a niche, high-priced data product into a must-have for elite investors like hedge funds, asset managers, and some of the brightest quants on the planet. She brings a rare mix of entrepreneurial grit, founder-style hustle, and even legal training to the revenue team that she leads. Today we'll talk about competing against inertia, which is especially relevant when you're the market leader, helping prospects see a problem they never planned for, and building a sales team that can hold its own with geniuses without needing to show off. Farah, thank you so much for joining me today. I am thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenica. That was a pretty impressive introduction. So I look forward to living up to that.
Oh man. Well, before we get into the heavy strategy, can you give us a quick snapshot of what you're working on today?
Absolutely. So my role is heading up the US sales team here at Neudata. So Neudata's solution works in a very niche industry. So we focus on data intelligence for financial services, essentially helping financial services firms find the right data that they're looking for their investment strategies. So we're not a data provider, but we help financial services find the data they need. So we're in a very specialized space. We've been around for about 10 years. We've grown a pretty steady client base. And most recently, we've expanded the sales team beyond just the chief revenue officer and myself in
Nice.
order to kind of capitalize on that next phase of growth. So
Brilliant.
I had a very good time for our trajectory.
That is, and it's exciting to watch because you really are in a unique position. There aren't a lot of companies offering what you offer, especially at the level at which you're providing it. So that's it's. I often tell people a story that when I was working with a sales team once, and the CRO was not real happy that we were there, and the CRO told us up front, we don't look. I don't even want you talking about competitive strategy with my players. We have no competitors in the marketplace, so don't even waste any time on that. And they were still up against inertia, against the status quo, where you actually do still have to sell. So even when you are the market leader and there aren't a lot of competitors in that space, it's not like they're always ripping it out of your hands saying, take my money now. You still have to actually sell. And it's kind of an art that I think sometimes is misunderstood. There are a lot of people who maybe haven't done it. Only 3% of the workforce, according to our most recent estimates, is even willing to do sales and do the hard part of selling. But I remember from our earlier conversation, you have a unique perspective in that you intentionally went into sales and you understand the marketplace dynamics largely because of your background before Neudata. Can you go into a little bit about your origin story?
Yeah, absolutely. We can go right back to the start. Happy to do that. Yeah, I think it all started with how I fell in love with sales, I guess. And I think I once phrased it as I didn't find sales, but sales found me. As in, I was busy trying to be entrepreneurial, supporting my mum's business, which was a food business at the time, and quickly realized that in order to get revenue for a food product, you need to sell it. So I didn't really have these skills. I hated cold calling, but I had to do it. I would
Yes.
make a few cold calls, then go hide in the bathroom for as long as I could. Um, Eventually luckily it just became normal to the point where I was so motivated on the end goal that actually it didn't hurt anymore. And so that whole process of sort of going out, calling, making something happen, and then actually getting a paycheck at the end was,
Ooh.
I think, a whole process that I fell in love with. So I'd argue that sales found me. And then fortunately, I've been able to kind of progress that, moving into more sort of software SaaS roles and really kind of perfect the sales skills. And I've always find it interesting because I kind of taught myself sales from a ground up, as in teaching myself the basics of a CRM by starting with an Excel and then kind of progressing it on to software, or teaching the basics of follow up or how to run a discovery call. And then interestingly, when I kind of made it into the software sales space, I realized that I was doing all these things. I just didn't know what they were called. But when you have to teach yourself, you kind of piece it together.
You do indeed, and that is the best way to learn. I love that. Oh my goodness, I'm curious now. You've got something that is incredibly valuable to your prospective clients. Um, what does a great first conversation look like with a prospective client when they didn't wake up that morning saying, this is a great day to change what we're doing and go with something new?
Interesting question. So, I always try to train myself and the team to think about an initial sales meeting as what's your ideal outcome. So
Mm.
you can always go for next steps after a sales call, but I try to train everyone to think about what do you actually want? What's your outcome that you want from this call? And ultimately, the outcome I think you really want as a salesperson at any call, especially in the first sales call, you want the prospect to agree with you that they have a problem that's worth solving, and you want the prospect to repeat back to your value proposition. That's really what you're looking for. You can achieve that after the first call. I think you've probably done your job, and then you have your next stages of proving the value, getting the pricing right, justifying the value, but really the first step is to get the prospect to agree that they have a problem worth solving and your solution is potentially the right one.
Love that. That's clarity. And it sounds so straightforward. You make it sound very easy, and it probably comes very smoothly to you. But it's amazing how often when we start working with sales teams, there isn't always that discipline of that pre-call planning. Like what are we actually doing this for? What are we going into this for? And it's not necessarily intuitive. Um, so I love that. And I'm curious, is there one question or a type of question, even like a type of question that your team asks that can reliably bring to the surface any kind of hidden pain or friction in a buyer who didn't think they had a problem and didn't realize perhaps that they might need what you offer?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. So I think the most valuable questions that our team do really well is probably sort of mid to near the end, probably halfway in the call to near the end, which is how can you see yourself using this solution? So if you ask that question, how do you see yourself using this solution? It's instantly going to tell you if they don't see that. It's really hard for them to. I think I read in your book the concept of lying. So I think it's really hard for them to lie, and if they don't see a way they can use it, I think it
Right.
also, because interestingly, what we get sometimes is we get a lot of positive feedback, but sometimes it's almost like people are shopping for someone else. Oh, I can really see how this is going to be helpful. This is going to be so good. And then at the end, they kind of say, oh, not for me, but I can see how it's helpful for someone else. So I think when you ask more of a practical question, how do you see yourself using this? It's really hard for them to not answer that as candidly as possible. And the ideal scenario is that they are able to see in their daily workflow when they would actually use this, what they would use it for. So that tends to be our. We can have one magic bullet. I would probably stick to that question. I think all the other discovery questions to try and understand pain, what their goals are all very valuable, but I think that question probably tells us more than most of the other questions.
I love that. That's very clear, and it helps them to kind of craft that vision of what this could actually mean for them, which is a very hard point of translation. We can hit the marketplace with something amazing, but until they have internalized what it means for them, it's hard to justify going through the pain of change. And I'm curious as excuse me, as we were talking before and I was learning about your company, there's a beautiful, strategic position in being in offering something that is excellent. It's maybe superior to other competitors. It's really in a market leader position, but there's still friction in going through the pain of change. Where do you see that friction popping up the most in your prospective clients when they maybe they're interested, but there's something missing that isn't, they're not quite going over the finish line. What kinds of friction do you see coming up? Are there competitors who jump in and try to undercut you, or is it just a really tough status quo? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think you've alluded to it in some of the kind of theories that you've shared already on this call, but I think it does kind of come down to that unexpected spend. So we're selling to people that are used to buying data. They're used to having a budget or an amount they're going to spend on data products that they're going to buy. And then when we position ourselves as this unique solution, they kind of don't know where to go with that. Well, is this a data product? Is this a research product? How do I actually justify this in my budget against data? And I think for a lot of them, they're maybe thinking, well, I can justify a data set because I'm going to use the data set, but how can I justify you? Because I'm not going to get the data from you. You're going to help me find the data. So yeah, I think that is partly in kind of understanding our value proposition and also helping to justify the business case. It kind of fits into both of those, which can become an objection, even if we manage to get people over that initial hurdle of understanding the concept and how they might see it in the workflow. They have to go and request budget ultimately, and sometimes they don't always know how to position it versus their other spend.
Right. And that's another unique challenge. I'm thinking back to the very early days of AI. We had some clients who were in the front line of providing these novel new technologies, these novel technologies of artificial intelligence. Everybody's like, what do we do with this? This is great. And they got so many demos, and that we had to help them stop doing demos because everybody was really interested in the technology. Nobody wanted to actually do anything with it because it was risky. It was new. And those early signs of, my team got, they booked 28 demos, today or whatever. They were looking at the metrics, the leading metrics that said this is going to be great. But in fact, it was a lot of interest in the novelty of it, but not so much where are we actually going to get the budget for this? Like this, we don't have anything in the budget. What is this? I don't even have a line item to put this in. And there was a lot of education that had to happen around that. And it's hard to change some of those organizations. A
Absolutely. Yeah, I
challenge.
think we're still in the early days of AI, but
Yes. Yes. People are still figuring out what box do I put this in this. You do have a highly technical product and you're selling to very smart people. How does I've heard you say before that you may even be selling to prospects who are smarter than you and your reps.
definitely smarter. No argument there.
How does that change the way that you build and coach your team? Because that might be intimidating for, I would imagine, some younger reps.
Yeah, it's definitely intimidating. I think what we've been able to do is craft into our advantage. So I think perhaps the advantage of not knowing that much is it forces humility. So maybe where you might get younger reps or just anyone really who thinks they know a topic, you're going to tend to lean on that a lot in your process versus if you don't have that knowledge, it kind of forces you to really listen. And I think it really forces some of those, key sales skills that you want, like active listening. You really want your sales team to properly listen and understand to what the pains are, what they're trying to achieve. So I think that really what we teach in the team is it's okay to not know. That's okay. The prospect doesn't really mind if you don't know. They just want you to understand what they're trying to say. As long as you
Oh,
can make them feel heard and you can articulate back what you've heard, that's really what's going to kind of help to move the sales along rather than you sounding knowledgeable and kind of falling into a knowledge trap, which
oh
I've
yes.
tried. It can be quite stressful to end up in that area. But that being said, naturally, the longer you're in this space, the more you do learn. So I've been in this space for about 5 years now. My boss, who I report to, our chief revenue officer, I want to say, been in the space for over 10 years, not just at Neudata. So naturally, you do build up more of that actual sort of market insight, which does absolutely support the sale and don't discourage it at all. It's still valuable, but I don't think you need it from day one. But I think over time, you are able to utilize it and combine that with maintaining that humility. I think can be even more powerful.
That is powerful. I Humility is something that it's a word I use a lot at Slattery because I grew up in the world of sales training. And so I've heard every possible sports metaphor. I have heard every possible, go get him, Tiger, motivational speech. And what wasn't talked about for many years, that my dad excelled in, is humility. And when we start working with sales teams, that's often the first thing that we have to have them understand is our goal is to get you to talk less, not more, because more selling happens with the less you talk than the more you talk. And they're like, but how will I sound knowledgeable? And they're terrified of giving up that position of, but I know a lot and therefore they will buy from me. And we're like, no, that's not typically where people will move through the pain of change. It's not enough. It's great to appear knowledgeable. But if you walk into a meeting and declare, I know more than you do, there are a lot of ways that that can go poorly.
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely find that, and really we are selling to the most knowledgeable people in the industry. But what I do find is one of those things that salespeople can build up quite quickly is using kind of the phrases like, oh, what we've seen similar clients do. And so what we've really aimed at armoring our sales team with is as many of those stories as possible. As in, as many, some people might call them war stories, but as many of those stories as this is what we typically see. Often other customers will do this or achieve this. And being able to share that insight, even if it's not as much as an investor knows about a particular topic, that in itself can often be helpful. And I remember one of my early sales managers saying, when you're in a sales call, your prospect needs to be able to leave thinking, I would have paid for that intelligence or paid for that value you get. So I think there's
Yes.
often things that I think luckily as salespeople, we actually do build up a lot of insight and expertise around an area. And sometimes we undervalue what just sharing high level what we're seeing from other customers. So
Oh,
we definitely build that into our sort of training as well.
well, that's brilliant. And I need to double click on that because there are a lot of organizations that we've worked with that haven't quite institutionalized that. Like they haven't written that down. And you're right. There are various names for it. At Slattery, we call it the one sentence story because it is such a powerful thing to be able to communicate in a conversation. One of the things that we're seeing in our 800 conversations a year we're having with executives at your level is this. And what we help our sales teams understand is you just did two things with that tiny little story. Number one, you put them in the okay chair. You've announced like you're not alone. We're here to solve a problem, but you're not somehow incompetent for having this problem, which unfortunately sometimes the assumption that salespeople can have when they hit the marketplace. Like you have a problem and I know more about it than you do. No. But you've just told them they're not alone. You see this a lot. There's nothing wrong with having this problem. But secondly, you've also built your experiential N. You just built up your credibility and you announced, we do this a lot. We have a lot of these conversations, but you didn't have to announce, we know more than you do on this. Because if we announce that, they may not believe us. And those stories are powerful. And I love the fact that you've thought to collect that and empower your sales teams with that. That's brilliant.
Definitely. I have to say as well, this I actually overlooked the importance of this when I was putting together the sales playbook for the team. And then when we started to onboard people, started to get this request. And so one of the first hires we made literally asked for this. And in my
Wow.
head, I'd kind of overlooked it because I'd been doing it so long, it just all existed in my head. But actually, the fact that it kind of came from within the team, it was really great to be able to let the team run with that and to be able to collect it and take ownership of that to then train the rest of the team. So I definitely can't take credit for having thought of that sooner, but definitely a learning, I think, in terms of what the team have been asking for that's most helpful
I
for
love that.
training.
I love that. If so, I'm curious. If we were to drop a microphone in to your team's conversation and we listened in on a great first call, let's say with portfolio manager or quant, what would we hear? And more importantly, what would we not hear in that great call?
Oh, interesting. What would we hear and what would we not hear? That's an interesting question. I haven't thought of it that way. Um,
And you don't
yeah,
have to
I think
spill any
for
state secrets too if you don't want to. It's okay.
I don't think there's any secrets. I just haven't thought about the structure. I think well, really for us, if we're going to get more specific about our industry, we do really want to understand if we're speaking with a portfolio manager, what is their investment strategy? What is it they're trying to achieve? What are they focused on? So we do need to have some specific relevance of what they're investing in. So if they're a macro investor investing in the global economy, that's going to be very different to someone that's investing in companies and public companies like an Amazon or a Google. So that in itself is very important to then know where to focus. So I think if a sales rep doesn't understand that in the first call, it's going to make it really difficult. And so that would be part technical knowledge, but I think we've managed to synthesize that to a few key areas. And then I think the real key thing for us is just really understanding the metrics around it. So you want to understand the pain. So what is it they're trying to solve? And we generally find that sometimes they can't always think of the pain. So sometimes we have to paint the pain and then let them figure out if that is a pain. So if we know their investment focus, we can understand a pain. And then if we're able to quantify that pain, then I think that puts us in a really good position to then the question that I think is the best question, or the kind of all rounder question: how can you see yourself getting value from this? I think if you kind of have that flow, then we tend to progress those opportunities pretty well. In terms of what we don't want to hear, I think it's harder for me to answer that. I don't think there's something you don't want to know, other than if you spend a bunch of time on other topics and you're not able to answer those questions. I guess that's maybe the costly bit. So maybe in
Yeah.
terms of what instead of what we don't want to hear, I think it's more about, maybe I'm getting a bit scientific here because I think I'm both an artist and also a scientist. It's trying to be able to answer those questions in the first 15 minutes. In my mind, you don't want to leave some of those really important things to the end. You want the end to be about closing for next steps, confirming that there is value. You really want to get most of those things in the first 10, 15 minutes, would be my kind of expectations to
Yeah.
see, which isn't always possible, of course, because sometimes prospects just want to see the demo, which is fair enough. So
Yeah.
you do have to pivot to the kind of person that you're dealing with.
Sure.
But yeah, I would say those are probably the most crucial things to understand.
Nice. Well, and I imagine in your area as well, I that takes discipline and focus to do that in a call, but I suspect your prospects appreciate it. They're probably very pressed for time. There's probably a very high opportunity cost to them taking that meeting. And it's funny how every industry is unique. In some, there might be a little bit more soft starts, but I would imagine that your prospects appreciate getting questions asked early.
Definitely, and I think there's a science to it. Someone has described me as surgical before. I'm very precise in what I'm looking to get out of a call, and I kind of instill that in the team. But I think the reason why we hire salespeople is for those EQ skills, and so I
Yeah.
think fortunately our salespeople are all highly skilled at not making anyone feel like they're being surgically questioned. But I think all of our sales team are very good. It's just making it feel like a genuinely interested conversation, but also like an expert conversation. So, there's lots of great things that I see across our team in terms of, uh, I've heard it called like fluffing questions, so that people feel like there's a purpose and there's a reason, and
Yeah.
making sure that you respond to answers, not just waiting to ask the next question, so that it flows very naturally. into
Yes.
what we're trying to show them, which is trying to get them to value.
Right. I love that. And it's funny that I've worked with enough sales teams over the years that I've had people, and I've heard this from rookies and I've heard this from people who've been selling for 30 years. I can't just jump into asking questions. I have to really, and they might use a metaphor, I gotta grease things first. I gotta really make it flow smoothly. And of course what they mean is, let's go bowling or golfing or whining and dining or whatever. And it just, what they're describing is a really long process. And they describe it as, I really have to build relationships because everybody buys on relationships. Like, I think we could shorten the cycle a little bit here. And what you're describing, I have often pointed to, and I've coached reps when we're talking, and I said, listen, companies will pay a lot of money to have consultants come in and ask a million questions. Nobody minds being understood. It's okay to come in and ask questions. And so because you use the term surgical, and it's like, it can intimidate some people to have questions that they need to get to quickly. But at the same time, I think it's a mindset shift to, nobody minds being understood. Nobody minds having somebody come in and ask questions. Now they do if it's like the Inquisition and we're going to ask a million questions and there's my commission check at the end. Like that's a very different orientation.
No, nobody wants a deposition. But
Exactly, exactly.
yeah.
Oh, and it's a very different approach. But what you're describing is, it's humble, it's direct, it doesn't waste anybody's time, and I think that's awesome. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the argument of relationship and value. And I think our business has grown from doing both. But I would argue that in our process, and well, one thing I would say is that I think software sales has kind of changed the game a bit from maybe some of the other sales we've had, where a lot of the big software companies for the last 10, 15 years, and particularly during COVID, a lot of the sales is just over video calls. So a lot of, and even before COVID, a lot of it was just over audio, not even video sharing. So you never really saw who you were selling to. So I think for software sales, it's been a bit more sort of value driven. I think our business is more unique, as in I physically moved to New York. We have a team physically in New York to make sure that we do plenty of in-person client meetings. And so we definitely make that an important part of our process. So often we aim to get a coffee in with a prospect or some step, but we normally get it in once initial value is established. Then we
Right.
normally build relationship and rapport over a period of time. And I think the relationship comes in most value when you get to the nearer the end stages, when you need a bit of help in terms of how do we get this approved, how do we get this through legal. I think that's where the relationship comes into most value. But I think to justify that, I think it's actually better to have the value conversation. And sometimes relationships can be a bit deceiving. So sometimes you
Ah,
might have a great relationship with someone, but they're never going to buy.
yes.
So
Yes.
I kind of put value selling first, and then I probably put relationship alongside it, but probably second to it.
Right. I love that. I would love to ask you, because you've got a very technical product, technical solution, I should say. It's not just a product, but it's a technical solution, and you're selling to very technical people. How do you keep conversations from going into the weeds too fast? And the reason I ask this is because we work with a lot of very smart clients at Slattery, and we've got, whether they're in precision manufacturing or software, there are a lot of really smart people who are on the front lines of bringing a solution to the marketplace. And one of the first things they're super duper excited to do is talk about the details. And it's an exercise in self restraint to say no, 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 not yet. How do you approach that? How do you keep the conversations with prospects from getting into the weeds too fast?
I think it defaults back to the fact we genuinely don't know sometimes.
Nice.
Yeah, I think so. To do complete any of our sales, we rely very heavily on the support of our research team in order to be able to complete a sale. For a lot of other organizations, it might be a kind of solutions engineer team or kind of pre post sales teams. So fortunately for us, I think we tend to lean on that quite heavily because normally if it's going into the weeds, normally it's going over our heads. So I think our job is more to make sure that we take really good notes of what the weeds are and then use that as our touch point to follow up, to kind of move it through into more detailed conversations, and kind of leverage that to prove out the value. So yeah, probably for us, if it's getting too technical, it's probably we don't understand. So we need to genuinely just need more help to answer their questions.
I love that. That's a very good argument for having a dedicated sales team. I love that. Oh man, what what do you think might be? I'm thinking of the leaders who are listening to this. For the leaders who are listening, what might be one habit inside their organization that looks harmless, but may quietly be pushing their reps into just knowledge dumping instead of real selling? What do you think might be some of the one habit that's quietly pushing them to just dump knowledge instead of selling?
um, hmm. I would imagine it probably goes back onto expectations with a salesperson, I would imagine. So I think, and I guess I'm jumping to how could you ever influence that? It's probably going to be in those one-to-one conversations between a sales manager and a sales rep. So yeah, I guess the way to avoid it is to focus on help sales reps focus on their sales process. And it's going back to some of those qualification things like medic. I think it's not complicated. I think it's generally pretty simple. I think it's making sure that you're always going back to strong pipeline reviews, making sure that you're understanding why is this qualified? How does it need to progress? Really just going back to the basics of how much of medic is covered or whatever other qualification process is used, I think. And by reinforcing that in each one to one, I would imagine then you're keeping sales reps really focused on what they should be focused on. And probably the technical weeds should be able to map back to part of medic in their process. If it doesn't, then we should be kind of training people to think the other way. And it comes back to that reinforcing. And then also using as many sort of team focused meetings to drive the right behaviors. So I guess I always think of it as focus on people's strengths and manage the weaknesses. So by kind of reiterating back to the main points and rather than clouding something as a negative, because there's probably some negatives in the technical expertise, but we need to make sure it aligns with um, the outcome, which is closing a deal.
Right.
So, but I guess those would be my views.
I love that, and I think you said something very powerful in the just in the expectation that there are one-on-ones and that there is that reinforcement happening, and it's interesting to me how often in organizations we see that the one-on-ones get pushed back, they don't have time for it, the leader is in a player coach role, and at the end of the day they have to focus on prospective clients, and the team kind of suffers as a result. And I'm curious if you've done a phenomenal job. I mean, you guys are kind of building the plane while flying it, and that's every growth story in a nutshell. How do you manage to do both? Because it's kind of the golden goal for so many sales teams to have somebody who can do both. Um, Still sell, bring in business, but also coach up really the next generation of sellers who can also do that. And that amount of attention that you mentioned is remarkable because not a lot of teams and leaders have that attention to it. So, how do you balance doing both?
Um, I would argue that no one balances both very well, and I would include myself in that. And I think that it is possible to balance both, but not forever. It's not a kind of long-term sustainable position, particularly if a company is genuinely growing. And you're constantly kind of growing the team, growing the sales numbers. I, I think one of the most important things is alignment with senior management. So if someone is a player coach, you need alignment from senior management on which one is most important, and if you have to make compromises, which one is it?
Amen.
So if you're being told by your senior management that it's more important that you get your individual contributor number, then ultimately you have to do that. And compensation structures will typically represent that right as well. And sadly, well, not sadly, but candidly, everyone has to provide an income for themselves and their families. And if your compensation aligns with the individual contributor over management, you have to make a choice.
Right.
Hopefully, what you want is a senior management team that see the long term value in the management piece, which I would argue everyone should, because what you don't want is a sales organization heavily dependent on one excellent salesperson. That's
Oh,
huge key person risk.
yes.
What you want is a sales organization that has a sales function. That's what you want. You don't want one great salesperson, you want a sales function. So you don't have key person risk. You have a function that you can continue to grow, that you can mature talent in. You don't want one killer salesperson. So
Right.
as long as management are aligned with that goal, I think you can make the right trade-offs, and it's always trade-offs. So my personal trade-off is team first, but for my own goal.
Mm,
I think that has more long-term value for the company. If I can have four other reps that can sell near as good as me, that's going to be better long term versus the X amount more I can sell if I do it myself. Um, but I think what I've found really difficult is the lack of control that you give up as an IC. So I know I can do things. So it's hard to let go of that. It's really hard to let go of the volume of prospecting I used to do. Really hard to let go of some accounts. Some accounts I know I could do it, but sometimes I hand them over to the team because I know that again I need to reprioritize where my focus is. So probably honestly probably the biggest trade-off is ego. You get a big thrill and hit closing a deal, but you have to kind of pass that glory on to the rest of the team and take as much pride in that as your own deals. So I don't think it's a constant trade-off. And anyone that does it forever, I would feel very strongly for them.
right. Oh man, it is a very tough place to be, and it's hopefully one that is transitory, and that's the goal. I love what you said though about putting the team first. That's hard. It's really hard, especially when you come from the individual contributor role. Man, if you I'm curious, and what you're saying just got my brain going in a whole bunch of different directions. So I'm bringing it all back because there's like so many ways I could possibly go from there. So much good stuff. You've got fabulous insights into leading a team and getting them to get those over the finish line. What is something that has surprised you the most? I mean, you've been an individual contributor, and now you're growing and leading team or teams. What has surprised you the most as you've led people?
I think what's the most pleasant surprise has been a different type of reward. So I just kind of alluded to that, that thrill as a salesperson of getting a contract signed, sending the invoice through. That's a real high that we live for. It's only going to be what the average conversion rate is somewhere between 10 to 20% for most sales deals, right? So that's you go through so many no's to get to that. And that's a big achievement. But I think the real pleasant surprise about management is that seeing a sales rep, someone you've trained, someone you've coached, someone you've worked alongside get that result, it's a different reward. It's not quite the same, but I would argue that I do enjoy it more. So I think that's been a real pleasant surprise. And I think that the difference is, yeah, when you let go and you let the team carry you, that's a really different feeling. But it gives others in the team an opportunity to step up and lead. And I think that is incredibly exciting. And again, completely different reward structure, but still pretty thrilling.
That's awesome. That is fantastic. And a few minutes ago, you talked about getting the ego out of the way and making space for that. And I'm thinking back to a lot of the companies that we've worked with over the last 4 decades have, humans are humans and we have egos and we build that into our structure. But I'm thinking of some of the founder-led companies that we've worked with, that hurts their valuation when it's the founder is still the primary seller and there isn't a sales function. Because you made a very good point about, you don't want a star salesperson, you want a sales function. And I had to go back and double click on that, because that's a really good observation. And I'm thinking back to the companies that we've come in to help. And it's hard when it's, let's say, the founder who's still the primary salesperson. We got to extract them if there's going to be any kind of valuation, because somebody's going to come in and assess, like, is this revenue replicable? And if the founder is gone, it may not be. And so the machine might fall apart. And so they put in a sales person or a small sales team. And what ends up happening 3 years later is it's the exact same problem. They've just shifted the problem. It's no longer the founder, it's now the star salesperson. And so it's exactly the same problem that you were just describing, where there's an over reliance on a key salesperson, and it's a risk, because if anything happens to them, it's risky. We don't want to be over reliant on a single client. We don't want to be over reliant on a single producer, and those things can really affect valuation. And so I love your perspective in that it's not the salesperson, it's the sales function. And what you've described in really codifying some of that knowledge, that shared wisdom around, here's how we sell. I love that. That is very valuable. You may not see it as much because you're like, it's like being a fish in water. But I have to tell you, the way you're doing it is remarkable. It's very remarkable. I know I have to respect your time, and so I do have to land the plane here, even though there are a million more questions that I could ask you, because this is fantastic. If you could go back, let's say 5 years, and give yourself one piece of advice about where you are today, let's say selling to very smart buyers, um, in a perhaps even in a market leading position, or even managing a team. So you can kind of take this in any of the directions that we've talked about today. But if you could go back in time to 5 years ago and give yourself one piece of advice about competing well here today, what would it be?
About competing well here. I think fortunately I had good advice from other people, so I might just leverage that. So Um, fortunately, our founder, who founded the company about 10 years ago, he's still in the business, but fortunately, he stepped away from sales quite early on and let the kind of sales function carry it. So we're quite lucky to have that. And actually, I can use some of the because I started at Neudata 5 years ago. It's about my 5 year anniversary, and the advice he gave me, because I joined very hungry and very enthusiastic to do really well. I was hungry to get promoted, hungry to move on to different parts of the business, take on more responsibility. And I think he gave some very good advice, which I listened to, which is just do your current job very well. And then any company is going to hold on to you, and they're going to want to move you and progress you. And so I think that was maybe took a bit of pressure off me. It was, hey, I don't need to try and do everything and be everything. But it was, as long as you just focus on doing what we've asked you to do really well, there's going to be more growth. And I think that has been very true. I think focusing on the first thing, getting meetings in, focusing on the next thing, closing deals, focusing on the next thing. How do I close more deals? Focusing on the next thing. How do I train my peers? And by gently kind of increasing that kind of each year, each performance review, I think that's allowed me to kind of take the pressure off, but also, yeah, stay focused and not try and do everything. But then it's kind of put me in a good position to then continue to grow into management roles, continue to grow and develop my own IC skills. I still have my own ambitions of different deal complexities that I haven't done yet that I would still like to do. So yeah, if I would go back and say anything, it would just be don't worry so much. Just swim in your lane. Because
Oh,
I think everyone is, hungry to get ahead, hungry to get the next promotion, and it will come. You just need to focus on doing that initial thing really well.
oh, that can be hard if you're focused on the future. That can be very hard. I love that. That's wise. I'm curious then, as we wrap up, what is perhaps one piece of advice you might have for let's say a founder or a board or an executive team that says we need to grow and we need to grow the sales function, we need to strengthen and grow the sales function, what would you tell them to look for when they're adding people to their team?
Hmm. That's interesting. So yeah, I think in this scenario, we're assuming that someone has strong product market fit. So we're assuming that they have a strong product team and maybe they're looking for their first sales hire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if maybe if I was in that role and I was hiring a sales function, I would look for someone that I would probably look for a maybe I'm being somewhat biased, but I'd probably look for a first time sales manager, but someone that really knows the process inside out. So I think in a when you're kind of founding, you want to some extent you want the naivety because you want people that haven't done it before so they can think of new ways to do things, but you also want someone that comes with a good foundational knowledge of what good looks like. So ideally you want someone that comes from good sales training that has good foundation, someone that's not guessing, someone that knows. I call it well, I kind of refer to it as like classically trained, like someone that knows the type of
Sure.
sales you're doing, but someone that I don't think it always works. Well, my personal view, I think there might be some advantages to having someone that doesn't have decades of experience in a
Right.
role because they might have certain expectations of what they should and shouldn't be doing versus I think if you get someone that's just on that cusp of enough knowledge but not tons, I think they're going to put the work in to find out. And I think you also really want someone that's going to get their hands messy at that point, right? You don't want someone that's immediately going to walk into a management role. You want someone that's going to comfortably walk into a management role, but is also going to do whatever they need to do outside of that. So you need someone that has the hustle as well. But again, I've never been in that seat, so I can't say it. But probably a bit of bias as well on what I've seen.
Right. Well, you just hit on something actually very profound as well, which is sometimes when a company gets to a certain growth stage, they think, okay, now we have to hire at this level, and by this level they mean we need to go hit up the Fortune 500 and poach somebody here or there. And the problem is, whoever they're bringing in probably came from someplace with a phenomenal marketing team, big marketing budget, and they've got the logo and the brand, and it's a very different thing to sell and to lead a team selling when you don't have that behind you, and it's a totally different environment. So what you were describing is that resonates deeply with us because we often are called to help our clients put the right talent in the right seats, and that's one of the things we have to help them understand is we may not want the top tier talent who's had 20 years of experience and a big brand because it's a very different environment. You're asking them to come into something that's scrappy and they need to hustle and, like you said, get their hands dirty, and that can be an adjustment. So I think that's spot on. I love that. I love that. I want to make sure I honor your calendar here. Again, there are so many more questions I could possibly ask you. But thank you, Farah, so much for your time and for bringing your insights and for being willing to share these insights with our listeners as well. This is tremendously valuable. You've been on the front lines. You have great stories from your experience of not only being an individual contributor, but also growing and leading sales teams. And thank you so much for bringing that perspective.
Great. Thank you, Jenica. Nice to be self-indulged for 50 minutes and talk about myself. So I appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.